This seminar is the third one in our seminar series, the Department of Government and International Studies of Hong Kong Baptist University. It's my pleasure this time to give you a paper, Trust, Transparency and Transdisciplinarity, Lessons from COVID-19. I must say the title of that paper is shifted somewhat. I mean, it might not even be the formal title that was advertised. If so, my apologies for that, very much so. But and I guess in a sense, before starting this seminar, this, struggling with the title says something more general about, I suppose, the difficulties we're having with interpreting COVID-19. One version, I won't go over all the versions of the titles, that would be a little bit tedious. So this is the title we have at the moment. But let me just say that before sharing with you my PowerPoint, I'm first of all going to introduce, in a sense, the terms of reference, the terms of the title. And then I'll basically structure my thought around three main themes, which I call the trust triptych. And I'll be looking at the terms of the trust triptych, so defining what we mean by trust, qualities of trust, and linkage of trust with transparency. But I'll be linking these very much, of course, to our case of COVID-19, framed in an international sense, and then I'll conclude. So, in a sense, it's an introduction, a three-part plan, if you like, and then a conclusion. And I think it's been a fascinating exercise for all of us, this. None of us are, in any sense, experts, I don't think, on the COVID-19. But this particular topic has taken me into previously unfathomed waters. But one thing I'm trying to do in this paper is to say, do political scientists and medical scientists need each other, in a sense? Are there commonalities? Are there lessons that can be drawn from the two? And particularly I'm focusing on the question of trust, because it seems to me that the COVID-19 represents at one level a question of trust. So what I try and do in the paper, there's a written version of this paper that I can send to people if they want, but what I try and do in the paper is to set out how the questions of trust are mapped out across disciplinary boundaries, and how in a sense they converge in a common interest shared between the medical and the social sciences in relation to our objects of COVID-19. That's what I'm trying to do in the paper. Let me now speak to it in a bit more detail. Come on. Okay, yeah. So that's the summary, really, of what I want to say. I've already sort of said that in my previous presentation, but let me just move on a little bit to say clearly we are, of course, not medical scientists, we're social scientists, and the COVID-19 calls, however, for a major transdisciplinary research effort that combines levels of analysis, and that's something I want to emphasize very much here. And indeed methodological tools, statistical, experimental, qualitative, comparative, interpretative, discursive. We can imagine all sorts of usages, in fact, or all sorts of approaches that would be entirely legitimate to tackle the subject. We're at the Department of Government and International Studies, and clearly from an international relations perspective, COVID-19 gets to the heart of what comprises a common good, or a global commons, if you like. From a public policy perspective, COVID-19 is what we might describe as a wicked policy problem. Wicked because it's extremely difficult to solve and it requires interagency collaboration. From a comparative politics perspective, COVID-19 provides a vast living data set to engage in multi-level comparisons. In the medical research field, the pandemic has provided advances in medical science that would not have been possible without access to a living laboratory. But one of the key themes in my talk today is the advance in knowledge related to the pandemic may have been or might be further accelerated if the international community and policymakers were more united in their administrative approach. And in a sense, this is a plea for transparency, for open data, for solutions migrating across systemic boundaries. And in a sense, it's a little bit of a normative paper in that sense, which is not usually the type of paper I engage in, but I think it's important in this context. So, of course, there are many cross-cutting themes from the social sciences. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but if we were thinking of power and society in the pandemic, which seems like a good seminar title to me, and so that will be the next one, actually, next week. And there are clearly many global and comparative perspectives, governances, and we have a fine tenant of the governance thesis with us today, Dion. Civil society, policy paradoxes, levels of analysis, policy transfer, country-based case studies. What I'm interested in, however, is the question of trust, and particularly the linkage of trust and transparency. It's a difficult issue. We'll start off with some definitions, but it is a bit like trying to pin a blancmange to a wall. You can maybe get the nail in there, but the blancmange slides down anyway, so you can't quite pin down this object of trust. The metaphor was slightly unusual perhaps, but it seems to me the best one. Levels of analysis, let's leave that for the moment. But what I want to do in this broad notion of a trust transparency nexus is to identify what I call as a triple triptych. And it refers to 3 levels of trust, 3 qualities of trust, and 3 dynamics of transparency. So if you like, there are 9 cases in a way. But this 3-by-3 approach, I think it's pertinent because the 3 levels, the 3 qualities and 3 dynamics each play a significant role. And my argument is that we need to align the planets, as French President Macron would say, or we need to bring into line these levels of trust, these qualities of trust and the dynamics of transparency. And that's the argument that we're trying to make today. So the triple triptych looks something like that. 3 levels of trust, and I'll come on to define these in a minute, but if we follow the political science literature, and particularly Zmerli and Newton, there are 3 levels of trust, broadly speaking: interpersonal or individual level trust, social or collective, or if you like, intermediate level trust, and political trust, which is a very thin sort of trust. Okay. There's also, I think, 3 main qualities of trust, and I turn here again, I dig in the literature, particularly the Dutch chap, Grimmelweisen, who talks about trust and performance, trust and connection, trust as a process of honesty or benevolence. In a sense, these are 3 different qualities, if you like, of trust. And then I talk about 3 dynamics of transparency, because there is not a single definition of transparency, there are many of them. But I focus on Heald's definition of four levels of transparency that I merge into 3. The first of them I call Bentham's panopticon, and I'll come back to that. But that is the open-ended prison whereby transparency is a form of, if you like, total control of the individual, a form of downwards transparency, but in a sense it's the political accountability that we're used to talking about in the liberal democratic systems, and then more of a horizontal transparency that in a way is a sort of new public management type of observation of organizations in a policy learning sort of framework. I'll come back to these, what I call the triple triptych. Definitions, of course, in a sense, I've sort of done my definitions in a way. I don't like to spend too much time on defining, but clearly, if we talk about definitions of trust, and the 3 levels of trust, we take trust as a generic term to describe dynamics taking place at 3 different levels: interpersonal, social, and collective or institutional, if you like. There's clearly, or micro, meso, and macro, or individual, intermediate, or institutional, whichever way we want to cut those 3 levels. And what's interesting in the piece I've written is that medical and social science also rely on 3 levels. I've been reading this medical scientist stuff, and it's very interesting how they look to the individual level of trust, the relationship between the patient and the practitioner, that up to intermediate levels, particularly if it's a pediatrician, for example, who, I mean, in a sense, the trusting relationship is with the child, but of course the intermediary has to intervene, the parents. So in a sense, that's immediately a sort of three-level relationship. And then the institutional relationship. If we think about health policy, what's the linkage between the practitioner, the client-patient relationship on the one hand, the health professionals and the health system as a whole in terms of hospitals, for example? These are clearly linked, but they're not exactly the same thing. So if we're thinking of trust at an individual, an intermediary, or an institutional level, we're not clearly talking about exactly the same thing. However, each type of analysis, and this is the rub of the argument, is important because the stakes are very high in COVID-19. Psychological well-being is extremely high stake. That's an individual level of analysis, more or less, not entirely, but more or less. Civil society and the health of civil society and how civil societies respond to the pandemic is extremely important. Does the pandemic signify the end of social capital? Is social capital possible actually in a pandemic? Or in actual fact, is social capital, does civil society manage to go beyond the pandemic? And this will actually in part be my argument. And then trust in government. Is trust in government the b.a.-ba, as the French would say, is trust in government actually it's the thinnest form of trust, but arguably it might be the most important sort of trust, particularly if we're trying to look for public policy solutions to these wicked issues that we're talking about. So trust then, in a sense, is a three-level game. We need individual responses, as reactions, social mediation, and governmental responses. And in a sense, becoming a bit more normative here, we might say that trust processes are important at each one of these levels. And the literature in political science, but also medical science, points to their mutually reinforcing character. In a pandemic, what the governments need to do, they need to persuade individuals to adapt their behaviours. So that's an individual sort of analysis. Individuals have to decide whether they're going to put on masks or whether they're going to go running in parks or whatever. These are individual decisions. Individual decisions will be all the more convincing in that they're nested in social networks. And by social networks, I'm not talking about Facebook or Instagram. I'm talking about the real social networks, the family networks, the community networks, and so on. And then, you know, if we read, and again, I don't very often do this, but I have been reading very recently some short articles from the medical perspective. And it's true that if you read these from psychologists, to some extent, to build trust and confidence, then there needs to be, in a sense, a form of coherence between these different levels of analysis. So in a sense, and coming to the political level, bringing into coherence the individual, the intermediate, and the institutional requires a form of coherent, legible, clear message on the pandemic. So mixed messages are not a good idea in a pandemic, okay? Mixed messages need to be avoided in the sense, so political leadership in this sense needs to be clear, legible, transparent, and that's the link a little bit with transparency, but I'll come on to it. So it's a three-level game. I play with various bits of these levels now. The work by Zmerli and Newton is absolutely central, of course, in understanding this from a science perspective. Defining three kinds of trust. There have been many others who've done this as well, of course, but in a sense, thick trust. Thick trust, it's a particular sort of trust. It's the trust that involves people who are known to us personally, our family, our friends, our work colleagues. And this thick trust is embedded in personal relationships that are very strong, frequent, and that are themselves nested in wider networks. But one can say that, and bring it on to COVID-19, within these tight personal networks, evidence from scholars working on psychological indicators points to an increase in indicators of social tension, a rise in divorces, for example, a rise in gender-based violence, phenomenon of isolation, and indeed even the very sad process whereby people cannot normally bury their dead. in normal circumstances. And these are all forms of actually, it can really, so in a sense, COVID-19 has, to some extent, tested personal networks. Personal networks that have survived arguably come up stronger, but if you look at the divorce rate in all countries, starting off with China, but then spilling over to other countries, and we see this in just about all the countries, the number of couples who actually have to live together in the confinement and find that they can't do, it's very strong. And so there's all sorts of social consequences for this. And again, I won't go particularly into some more definitions here, but I mean, one of the classic definitions of what is trust, it's Rousseau and his colleagues, trust is a psychological state comprising the intention to accept vulnerability based on positive expectations of the intentions or behavior of another. So in a sense, if you trust individually, then you are actually, you're individually accepting. You're accepting vulnerability, you're accepting to confer on another to an extent a part of your own balance or evolution. I suppose in a sense, if trust breaks down at this individual level, then there are clearly, or there might clearly be damaging psychological consequences. Again, this is not the work I've done, but clearly the cross-national evidence from lockdowns or confinements on the state of psychological well-being of many individuals, if we read the secondary literature, has been quite damaging in terms of primary networks and indeed practices as a result of social distance. Again, great that the bars are now becoming open again. And when I tell people back in Europe that actually in Hong Kong they've never shut the bars and restaurants, they go, "Oh, you're so lucky to be in Hong Kong," because in other places they have shut the bars and restaurants and the pubs. I know, and they're still shut. Well, certainly they are in the UK. And so, in a sense, it's these are the basic elements in the sense of life that they're very difficult actually to not deal with. So, an impact on particular social trust. We move on to the sort of second level. We might call this generalized social trust. A generalized social trust, it's not as thick as personal social trust. It's thinner, but it's the trust that we place in unknown others. Okay, and that's probably the most important trust. We don't know everybody. We think about Benedict Anderson and imagined communities and all that literature on what is the nation. We don't know everybody who's French or British or whatever. But the idea is there's an empathy with them. And maybe this is an interesting part about COVID. But has it demonstrated an ability to empathize with members of an imagined community? And what is that imagined community? Is it the region? Is it the nation? Is it a continent? Or hasn't it? This is a question for discussion. But I think it's very, very interesting how we've seen obviously contradictory writings here, depending on what we read. But it's interesting. There's a general trend across most countries to celebrate and applaud health workers. Okay. It started off in Italy on the balconies, and then it spread in France. They're doing it every night at 8 o'clock, and then in the UK they've been doing it. And there's a sort of general feeling that the nurses, the health workers, they're in a sense they're the finest of the community. In a sense, they're endangering. They're facing personal danger in their jobs. They deserve to be protected and they deserve to be applauded. In a sense, that's a form of that's a form of consolidated, generalized social trust, I think. And some people have, reading some of the stuff, interesting how, clearly the family, and this goes a bit against the first argument I was putting forward, but that's okay. The family, to some extent, might emerge stronger. Has there been a national basis to this? Well, I think there has been, actually. Maybe we're moving away from this now, particularly in the European context, where the EU sort of made a strong comeback. But I think the national reaction to start with is extremely strong. The fact that these particular common issues are nonetheless framed in distinctive national discursive registers, different from France and from the UK. It's all quite similar. but different, actually, using different sorts of identity marker in many senses, and we can perhaps raise questions. And then this question of social capital. I think, in a sense, how civil society has reacted to the pandemic is a very interesting question. It's not one we'll solve today, but physically speaking, one might argue, you know, social interaction requires physical presence. It requires people meeting each other. You know, it requires interaction. Okay, and you could argue that to some extent, the pandemic closed off civil society, excuse me, in that sense. Of course, you can drink your apéro on the web or do whatever you want to do on the web, but you know, in terms of actual physical interaction, then clearly the pandemic appeared to close this off, at least for its duration. But society has not collapsed, of course. Even where the confinement was extremely harsh, as in the French case, where it was very harsh, you know, you had to print off this bit of paper, and if you got stopped by the police, you were fined 135 euros. And you know, half of my family is French, so they were telling me a lot about how actually it was quite difficult to get across Lille, for example, and all the strategies that were being used. So I think, in a sense, clearly, but civil society has actually not collapsed. And I think we were talking about this last time with Chris's paper. You know, in many senses, there's not actually been a collapse. Civil society has stood up pretty well by and large, actually, to this. But then I stand to be contradicted, of course, on this as everything else. But clearly, this is, you know, is at least one interpretation. Move to political trust, which in a sense we're political scientists, or we'd like to be anyway. So this is our natural sort of way of. And if we go, as Huygens merely defined political trust as a very thin form of trust, characterized by a kind of general expectation that on the whole, political leaders will act according to the rules of the game. That's a much thinner trust than the particular social trust or the general social trust. And if we take indexes of political trust well before the COVID crisis, most of them converge to suggest a general decline across liberal democracies in the past decade or so, even before COVID crisis. We take the Edelman Trust Barometer, that's one of them. There's loads and loads of these things, and they're all saying more or less the same thing. There's national variation, but nonetheless the tendency is for a diminishing trust in liberal democratic societies. All sorts of reasons that are generic and nationally specific. And what's interesting, however, if we look at the particular trust cycle with COVID-19 and previous pandemics, there's a sort of some of the previous literature on the HRNR, I can only say that in French, the H1N1 pandemic, the flu pandemic, that it tends to be a short-term rallying to the government. You know, the government, if you like, there's a short-term rallying to the executive, as it was President Macron declares the war on this invisible enemy, and in a very short term there's a rallying to the executive because it's a crisis, and that usually happens when there's a crisis. But then that's followed by a deeper unpopularity as it becomes clear that this capability expectations gap becomes, you know, manifest. Political discourse cannot actually cope with the reality, in fact, of what needs to be done during the crisis. And then we might even say that at the end, there's a danger of a hollowing out of civil society or a weakening of civil liberties. And this is clearly one of the issues that's been raised in the democratic countries, at least. Major challenge, take the French case again, Stop COVID, which is the application on the telephone to help. You know, if you download it, then you can presumably help to, and if you cross someone who's got the virus, then it will alert this individual that they've got the virus. My technical explanation is not very good, but I think you've all got it. It's an application on the telephone. But of course, if you download that application, then in a sense, your own personal datas are being. This discussion on this, but you know, there's an argument that you might be. Subject, you know, to some extent, it might have an impact on your own personal liberties. So there's that dimension. There's a national sovereignty dimension, which I think we can see borne out by the race for the vaccine. Which nation will get the vaccine first? The deals that are being done between universities and big pharmaceutical firms. We talked about Oxford the last time round, but there's other ones as well. The national protectionist practices. And again, the case of Sanofi is interesting here because, of course, Sanofi developed for the Americans with American funding vaccine and then created a scandal in France by saying, well, actually, the first doses would be reserved for Americans. They had to come back up again, you know, to renounce their position here. And even within the EU, there's a lot of competition. Well, of course, the European Union has shown good, if you like, in the last few weeks. And we can come back to that in questions, if you like. But there's clearly difficulties of interpretation here. And there's always difficulties of interpretation in social sciences. Can we say anything, actually, now? We're only a few months into the COVID crisis. What's the temporality that we need to have to say something convincing here? We're all trying anyway. But for example, and again, coming back to Chris and Dion's presentation the last time, does COVID symbolically represent a brutal stop to globalization? Does it restore a form of national sovereignty? Does it threaten to accelerate decoupling between China and the US? What it might do, but we're not sure, to be honest. It's probably too early to tell. And it would depend a little bit on which particular dimension we're talking about. But these are the right questions. And in a sense, as social scientists, we try and raise questions. We don't always have the answers to those questions. And if we move on, this again, I'm being a little bit, I'm moving away from my triptych here because I'm including international political trust. But clearly, at an international level, mistrust is clearly one dimension of the ongoing great power rivalry between the United States and China in particular, with Europe in the main, a perplexed and rather wounded bystander for most of this crisis at least. I'm not going to go over again what Professor Cabestan said in his talk, Jean-Pierre, but clearly there's controversy over the provenance of the pandemic, the appropriate description of it. All of those issues I'll leave to a side, but it's clear that at the very least, it's become an intervening variable of the increasingly bitter global contest between China and the US, and between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump in particular. Mistrust, however, is inherent in realist framings of the international system. We shouldn't, we shouldn't claim that it isn't. I mean, in a sense, the mistrust is the realist framing of the international system. So what's unusual about that? So that's my first triptych. I'm moving on now to my second, which is trust as quality. And I'm taking trust as performance, connection, and benevolence. I didn't invent this, incidentally. There's some great work done on this, the whole massive trust literature, but in particular, Grimmelwiesen and others came up particularly the idea of trust as performance, connection, and benevolence. But I think it's a very useful frame, actually, to apply. We could say that those three qualities of trust are most effective when they're combined. We can understand performance for our current purposes as, in discursive terms, we might understand it as performativity. And again, we might say that coherent speech acts need to be underpinned by consistent reasoning. And they're the best shape to be able to persuade and most likely to be able to nudge citizens. I use the word nudge, of course, very carefully there, because there's a whole literature on the importance of nudge in public policy. But this seems to me to be quite a good example of nudge, actually, and how it can be used. But in a sense, there we've got three levels of analysis. We've got, to some extent, the speech act, and again, I'm borrowing, of course, from my esteemed colleagues here, but in a sense, there has to be, in a sense, I would probably call it a coherent legitimizing discourse rather than speech act, but it probably is not that different, actually. The messages need to be consistent within their own terms of reference. That's the main point. Messages can be different. You either go for lockdown or you don't, but there needs to be some consistency in that message. And I suppose, as the French would say, the cacophonie, there might have been a bit of cacophony in the French case at the beginning, particularly about the value or not of putting a mask on, whether the mask had any impact on spreading the virus and so on. The US case, there's, a lot of cacophony there, and of course, interesting with the US federal system with extremely different dynamics going on in different states and party politics becoming an important variable of that. And even worse, the transgressive behaviour of advisors in the United Kingdom. And I'm thinking in particular of Dominic Cumming, who is a sort of the Machiavelli of Boris Johnson, lurking there in the shadows, twisting. I'm sure he's listening, but I think we can say we have freedom of speech here in Hong Kong.
Cardinal Richelieu.
But anyway, Cumming basically, you know, I mean, obviously, you know, this is the advisor of Boris Johnson who was extremely influential, not just in terms of Brexit, but also in terms of visiting his family and breaking all the rules that Boris Johnson's own government had edicted and getting away with it. And this is what's the transgressive behaviour is. And sparking a revolt within the Conservative Party, because that sort of behaviour should not be tolerated. Okay, so trust, and then again, this is a little bit of a repetition, but in a sense, in this medical literature I've been reading, medical transition practitioners will say there needs to be a degree of transparency in terms of access to decisions and to information about being the best way of influencing behaviour during a pandemic, and hence restoring trust. And again, that was the article on from the Dutch team on the F1 pandemic. But the idea is that, you know, clearly transparency, and I'll move on to my third part now, which is transparency. The transparency, for all of its contradictions, which we'll now come on and talk about, has an important emotional value, because it's emotionally linked to the form of trust building. It seemed to be a sort of commitment to telling the truth, in a sense, and to putting light on hidden, complex processes. Whether it is or not, of course, is another matter. And this moves on to the third part of my talk today about transparency. Is transparency a mechanism to restore trust? Well, what do we mean by transparency? We should always start with the definition. Let's take the Cambridge Dictionary. Transparency is the characteristic of being easy to see through. You probably can't disagree with that. It's a physical characteristic. A glass, for example, is transparent unless it's got cloudy beer in it. Okay. But anyway, let's leave that aside for the moment. It's usually transparent. Applied to individuals, to see through, it's understood in a figurative sense. It's a synonym of truth and authenticity. And in a public policy framework, transparency is often associated with the qualities that architects attribute to glass: purity, protection, security. There's a whole lot of literature on this, very interesting, about architecture. When I was in Wales, of course, the National Assembly for Wales is a very interesting building. It's totally transparent. So you can see anywhere. It's a great building. If ever in Cardiff, have a look at it. So I'm saying that to my friends in the National Assembly in Wales. But basically, it is a fantastic building. And you can see from anywhere in the building, you have a total transparency on all the actions that are going on in the Assembly chamber. And it's won all sorts of prizes. That sort of symbolises, if you like, transparency as being an open, good, public good for citizens. But of course, there are different readings of transparency. One of the most germane works is that of Heald in his work on trust and transparency. But he points out that transparency is a multidimensional concept that can have unintended consequences. And he has a very nice definition for directions of transparency. Vertical transparency. This is where a person or an organization has a hierarchical oversight over another person or an organization. Upwards transparency. This is where the superior can observe the subordinate. Downwards transparency. This is where the ruler is accountable to the ruled. But horizontal transparency, which is defined as the availability of information about an organization or an actor that allows external actors to monitor the internal working performance of that organization. It's a form of, in a sense, new public management, of observing organizations from the outside. So 4 different forms of transparency. Now this is quite important, I think, for COVID-19, because what I try and do is mix. I don't like 4s, I like 3s, you know. I don't get everything into 3, it's much easier than 4. And then, being slightly, leaving that aside for the moment, I think it does make sense actually to merge Heald's vertical transparency and upwards transparency. They're sort of saying the same thing in a way. So if we go back, vertical transparency, a person has a hierarchy of oversight, and upwards transparency, the superior can observe the subordinate. It's different, but more or less the same thing. And I thought it would be useful to say this is a modern equivalent of Jeremy Bentham's panopticon, which is the prism, where you can, the central guardian can observe all the inmates. So it can observe all of the activities of all of the subordinates, if like, all of the inmates. So in this sense, transparency is not at all in terms of well, transparency is the ultimate form of social control, basically, in that utilitarian mechanism. It's the ultimate form of social control. You can observe everything because the ruler has a transparent oversight into the activities of the ruled, and it's actually a form of totalitarianism, if you like, or potentially a form of totalitarianism. And such mechanisms are possibly efficient, especially when physical movement needs to be limited. But if they're administered in a technologically absolute manner, as arguably they are in some countries, then if they pay little attention to the distinction between public and private, then clearly they might be challenged in some respects. This is not a value judgment here. It's just trying to see how we, in a sense, it's typology more than anything else. Clearly, this is one form of transparency. Another form of transparency, and one that links with trust and transparency, because that first form of transparency doesn't have much trust in it. It's a transparency based on mistrust by and large, although one might disagree with me, but anyway, you can in questions later. But the second form of transparency clearly does have an element of trust in it. And this is the horizontal and the downward directions in Heald's matrix. And we might say that downwards transparency is a form of reformulation of the doctrine of critical accountability, signifying actually a degree of dissatisfaction with political governors in most countries surveyed during the COVID crisis, at least. And we might say that there's actually a real difference here between Western liberal democracies and more authoritarian regimes. And I'll finish with this slightly provocative observation. Authoritarian regimes, China, but also Turkey, Russia, Iran, have made claims about superior efficiency in relation to the COVID crisis. But these need to be tested against a cognate level of transparency, so those that democratic regimes have had to deal with. You could say that trust without transparency is certainly trust. Actually, that's wrong. I realised when reading that's actually wrong. It should be that transparency without trust. I'm getting my trusts and transparencies mixed up. That should be that there's a form of transparency that doesn't necessarily need to have much trust to be a relationship in an authoritarian regime, whereas in a more democratic regime, and I'm being a bit provocative here, but I hope this will raise some questions, trust has to come with a degree of transparency. If not, there are big reactions, and we can see this actually when governors, and again, let's take any of our European countries, but I don't always take the French example, or many others as well, but maybe the British example is better than this one, but for this one actually. It does not seem to be sufficient consistency, transparency about medical advice, about processes, then that's what breeds the mistrust. But to some extent, that mistrust has there's a feed through or a loop back effect, because basically that does feed through ultimately. Ultimately, democratic political leaders are accountable to their electorates, and they do have to be accountable. And so in a sense, that's where I think the COVID-19 and trust transparency nexus allows us to make some general distinctions. Conclusion, is transparency a mechanism to restore trust? Well, it's certainly not proven. Although it is probably true that a lack of transparency aggravates mistrust. And I've talked about this in other work that I've done. And there's some examples of individual countries here. I've given the mask example already in the French case, but that was a classic one, actually, of saying that the masks didn't matter because they didn't have the masks. And then now saying that you can't actually get on the train unless you have a mask. So there's clearly been a shift. There's clearly a lot of mistrust between the big players here. I think in a sense, my final remarks are that COVID-19, it is a wicked policy problem. Now, in public policy, wicked policy problems are problems that don't have a solution, but they require multiple solutions and they depend on multiple actors and their cooperation. And this is what we might call a wicked policy problem. Transparency appears to be a more neutral narrative than trust, but it's not entirely neutral. And a requirement to combat a global pandemic, because it's a global commons and we're all living in one society, one global society, it requires the ability to engage in policy transfer, to have trust at a global level, if you like. And so there has to be an international exploration of the causes of the COVID-19 crisis, which requires open access to data. And the task of disinterested political leadership will probably fall mainly on the shoulders of the main democracies that need to reform that system from within and resist the uncoupling that is gathering pace. And that's my conclusion. Yeah. I spoke for 45 minutes. That's, I think, I mean, I could carry on, but I think that's the sort of I like to just speak for the time that's allotted to me. Please go ahead. You may.
Yeah, okay, so thank you, Alistair. I have 3 short questions.
Oh dear.
So I start with the first one, which is, you mentioned at the beginning social sciences and medical sciences.
Yeah.
So you exclude, so did you really want to do science and social sciences? And then what about business studies? Because everything that you have seen with the COVID crisis is basically the stopping of globalization and the stopping of global business. And that has a lot of impact on this. So I don't know whether you wanted to introduce that later on or not. Second question, you mentioned trust and mistrust or distrust. And it sounds like a 0-1, like an electricity type of a thing. That is either there is trust or there is mistrust. But rather, there is a lot of levels of trust in you. And there's never entirely trust and never entirely mistrust. And sometimes you can trust the same partner or the same organization for one thing and not trust him for something else. So how can you differentiate the levels of trust and how can you measure that in social sciences? And now I come to my third question. Obviously, you did a brilliant expose on what the literature has brought and to what extent the literature can help us understand the COVID-19 crisis. But the question is, to what extent the COVID-19 can help us revisit the literature? That is the other way around. So as we see a lot of research emerging now, those research explore how COVID-19 are shaking the foundations of our understanding of the modern world. So to what extent do you foresee that this COVID-19 situation is going to help us reformulate the trust transparency paradigm?
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Emily. That's very good questions. I think on the first one, business studies, this is a generic sort of presentation, so I would class business studies as being part of social sciences, actually. I mean, I think we could sort of drill down a bit more, but clearly a lot of the literature I'm talking about would be in business schools, actually. A lot of it's public management, and a lot of that literature, I mean, where does the cut come in a way? I mean, in most, say, I spent most of my career in the UK, and business management schools would be considered as social sciences, broadly speaking, in the UK. So for me, that's clearly that's the easy question in a way. The second question, levels of trust, of course, absolutely. And in a sense, here this is the sort of the big picture stuff. The levels of trust, I suppose I'm not going to be sort of pedantic and refer you to my article in the Journal of Trust Research, 2018, but in a sense, there I talk about, because we did some logistical regression actually on the basis of a survey we did in the French regions, and we were there trying to talk about different levels of trust, I suppose particularly between levels of government. So that's just because but it is an extremely interesting and important question. It's not a zero-sum game, trust and mistrust. It's not a zero-sum game. There are clearly levels of trust and levels of mistrust. However, I think in terms of definitional clarity, I think we do have to have some positions here around which we can sort of organize, if you like, our reflections. So I absolutely take your point, and it's also one of the things I was trying to say in my paper here is it's also a question really of levels of analysis, because in a sense, if we're trying to, this leads on to my answer to your third question. You're quite right, in a sense, I'm using the literature to interpret COVID. And it's, I think the COVID might well reinterpret the literature. And in a way, I hope it does, but it's too early to say. I think in a sense, we ought to be a little bit careful about drawing too many conclusions now, actually. And that's one of the points I've been trying to make in my paper. We can certainly use literatures to try and interpret COVID. And I think you're quite, in a way, what struck me really preparing for this paper was actually how the commonalities, in a sense, between very different epistemological and ontological traditions looking at this issue. That's what struck me. So I think those are three excellent questions. And I think what I would say is, in terms of trying to, is the essential synergies between these different approaches, because clearly, if in more normative terms, if we're saying, well, what do we do to face this pandemic? How do we resolve the crisis? Then clearly we need to inculcate a sense of individual responsibility that needs to be socially embedded and that needs to have a clear steer, in a sense, from a relatively transparent set of governments. In a way, that's very. So I think you're very, very, very nice questions, and I'll certainly bear them in mind. Christian.
Well, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I think trust and transparency are two incredibly important variables, and most of the readings that at least we give to our students, they're actually, I think, kind of undervalued. I also have three items, if I may. Omne trium perfectum, as the ancient Romans would say. The first question is, you mentioned that in your first part of your talk, national versus supranational. That refers to the idea, and I think we also alluded to that in our talk last week. The argument that a lot of, say, supporters of nationalism make these days is that apparently the COVID-19 crisis proved that only national organizations, nationally based states can be effective, and supranational structures not so much. Usually the example of WHO and European Union is given. So I wonder what's your take on that. There's clearly a debate these days, national versus supranational. What can we actually say if we look at the COVID-19 crisis, according to you? What we have seen, is it a proof of national level of identity and organization being more effective or not? My second question is, you mentioned that there's a number of reasons for the diminishing trust in liberal democracies in general. My question is, can we perhaps say that it's not really about the diminishing trust in liberal democracies as much as it is a diminishing trust in liberal democratic elites? A number of, especially right-wing commentators make an argument of an already existing new class, liberalistocracy. So, this group of people who call themselves liberals, but they are the new elites, just like the aristocracy back in the day. And my third question is more local. It's about trust and transparency in the case of Hong Kong. I mean, you know, what do you make of the Hong Kong situation? I'm kind of struck. In Hong Kong, I remember at first, if I'm not mistaken, the Chief Executive Carrie Lam did say, at the very beginning of the pandemic, did say something like, there's no need to wear masks. I mean, this is exactly the same case that the Minister of Public Health in my country did. At the beginning said, no reason to wear masks. The next thing you know, after 4 weeks or so, you'll probably have to wear masks till the end of your lives, you know, or until we come up with a vaccination. So that does not really induce trust. Hong Kong has done very well. I know, and well, I think we all know that in terms of trust, Hong Kong government is not doing very well. Not sure about transparency though, and you know how they relate to each other in the case of Hong Kong. If you feel competent enough to address this in the case of Hong Kong, I think Hong Kong is a very interesting case also because it's one of the safest places on earth right now with only 4 death cases and you know basically it's safe.
Okay, thanks, Chris. So again, 3 excellent questions. Let me answer. Let me have my start. Okay. I think the first question, it's a very difficult question to answer, to be honest. And I think, in a sense, I would need to sort of disaggregate a little bit the question because, in a sense, the national context should probably be framed in the plural because there are national contexts, I think. And I think to some degree, there have been variable, what struck me actually is how there have been variable national relationships and national reactions to the crisis that in a sense, in a very, very basic sense, sort of reconfirmed the set of national stereotypes. Boris Johnson said, well, look, we're not going to have a lockdown because the Englishman is a free man. Liberty for an Englishman is essential. And we did talk about Scots and Irish, incidentally, but it doesn't matter. And so, in a sense, that was very much, you know, that was very much in what you might expect from that sort of party politician. In the French context, it's immediately a sort of fairly, in my review at least, you know, it's quite a hard Republican. We don't want territorial differentiation. Whatever's happening in Brittany, however it goes off in the Grand Est, that's the same as in Brittany. Well, there's no cases in Brittany, and in the Grand Est, people are seriously ill. Then suddenly there becomes a recognition of the need to take into account the territorial variable. In Germany, there's, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a set of national variations. I think the at one level, what strikes me is that the reactions to this COVID business were taking place first and foremost nationally. So there were a set of national reactions. But then I do think, in terms of international organisations, obviously it depends on whether it's over the European Union or the WHO. I didn't mention the WHO. I know that Professor Caviston will pick me up on that. But I mean, and in a sense, you know, clearly, the EU dimension, I think, is the one I'm interested in. And that's been extremely interesting because I think it's true the EU were very wrong-footed at the beginning. Christine Lagarde, the IMF, was very wrong-footed, actually. So the big international organisations, I want to call them that, were wrong-footed to start with. But then I think the way that the European Union has reacted has actually proven that, in a sense, European integration proceeds through crisis. Because whatever you think, you know, the French and German deal, basically, that took place a couple of weeks ago is a very important one. The European Commission is being much more interventionist than it could have hoped to have been just a few months ago. Even the Dutch are sort of saying, well, in actual fact, we do need to allow more intervention, and we do need to sort of accept that there could be transfers in relation, you know, to less fortunate countries because of this crisis. So in a sense, it's a sort of tipping point. Right. What happens from there? That's another question. I think in terms of the euro, it's interesting because every 10 years or so there's a crisis of the euro, or every 5 years, whatever. And it's an existential crisis, really. And this particular crisis, I think what was interesting, sorry, yeah, I think it was, I'll speed up a bit, but I think this time around, what happened was, it starts off, Germany took the very traditional stance it always takes, which is it's a saints and sinners stance. It's, we don't, we're the saints and we don't give money to sinners. Mm-hmm. Sinners are in South Europe. We don't engage that. The Dutch are even stronger. However, there's been a fairly radical evolution actually over the last few weeks, and so we'll see exactly what that produces. But I think in a sense, so in a way, the European Union's reacted in a, it started off, it had a poor crisis to start with, but it's growing into it, I think, is the answer. The WHO had a poor crisis, full stop, to anticipate your question. Secondly, let me, so that was the international organizations. The second question, I haven't got my reading glasses on, but it's like anti-elites, yeah, sorry. I put these glasses on so I can see you guys, but I can't read what I've written here, but anyway. And see people on the outside as well, of course. Essentially, elites, there's been a lot of data done on trust. There's a lot of data demonstrating that political elites, varies according to country, of course, big national variations, but there's been a lot of trust that, saying that over the last 20 years or so, there's been a diminution in general of trust in political elites. But I think we should be careful about deducing too much from that, because or we should be careful from distinguishing, if you like, our social scientific analysis from perhaps some of the more normative analyses that some populist, national populist theorists would sort of put forward, in a sense. Because the anti-elite debate, it is also an anti-sort of, it's anti-elite, it's anti-cosmopolitan, it's sometimes anti-democratic, put it that way. And thirdly, on the Hong Kong, well, yes, it has done very well. Of course, we all read the excellent piece by Zhu, was it, from the Institut Montaigne that you sent to us, Jean-Pierre. That's very, very interesting. It just one of the articles on Hong Kong. And really, of course, in a sense, but if I'm taking my three levels of analysis there, then clearly it backs up the first and the second one, not so much the third. Because I think that in a sense, what we have here is a vibrant civil society that reacted on the basis of its previous experience with the previous pandemic, and that reacted in a sense almost against, but let's not forget that there had to be that strike by doctors to close the border right at the beginning. And then, to some extent, wearing the mask, let's not forget, certainly when I was already in Hong Kong, when the mask ban, the constitutional ban on wearing masks was introduced, wow. So in a sense, if we're talking about consistency, then clearly this leaves something to be desired. So well done, Hong Kong. Remain, obviously, Hong Kong has to retain its vibrant civil society and continue to steer itself in whatever the future holds.
I have a few questions,
okay.
Or remarks and no comments. But thanks a lot for your very comprehensive presentation of the trust debate among social scientists. There is one issue you haven't touched upon very much as a variable in the whole game, is the scientists. Because the scientists in France and elsewhere, they've been divided from day one, and they've been changing from day one, influencing governments, influencing public policies. So that's my first point. And can you tell us more about the scientists variable in this whole game? The second one is, you mentioned in terms of three qualities of trust. You mentioned performance, but the way you approach performance in your presentation was very much about the discourse, the message, the messaging, rather than public policies. Because actually, what makes performance trustworthy in a way is two things. I mean, consistency in action, but also performance. I mean, results. And it has to do with, there's one word you didn't pronounce, governance. Did you? I forgot. I don't think you did. Only once. So because, the Chinese argument, they want to promote governance in a non-transparent authoritarian setting or environment, which is pretty very problematic to me. But in any event, that's why I would like to push you a bit further on this question of action, public policies, governance, and how you reach or you regain trust through your actions, much more than through your. Of course, the messaging is important. I mean, we discussed that last time. The contrast between Macron's war against COVID-19 and Merkel's, much more inclusive and much more round type of discourse is something which interesting to contrast. What you said about the Hobson international environment is very true. I don't think we're gonna be able to overcome that, because you mentioned at the beginning, cooperation is needed. Yes, but we will never achieve it. I mean, up to a point, yes, we need to cooperate, and the WHO is a good example. How far we can cooperate, but how much do we distrust each other, and the great part. So I think the race for vaccine is pretty much the point, and it's not gonna change. So those are my, I think, major remarks for the moment. But I like the Hill model of transparency. Whether it's enough, I don't think so. The sad thing about the French case, Macron has been the target of so many attacks, and the problem is much more a problem of, and that's maybe the last one, of image rather than trust. In times of crisis, you need the father of the nation. The trouble with Macron is way too young to be the father of the nation.
That's why he became the one.
He could be my son, I'm going to trust him, And that's a real issue. In times of crisis, you need someone like de Gaulle, to get out of the Algerian crisis, Algerian war. And he's but the only one to be able to do so. But Macron, the trouble is you don't trust him. He looks, like a Boy Scout sometimes. I'm sorry about it. I hope he's recorded.
I think he's looking more he's looking more like a Man Scout now than a Boy Scout. He's taken a few lines, as they say. Thanks for those questions. In actual fact, I mean, all of them I agree with. And in the written version of the paper, for the performance dimension, I do talk much more in terms of the public management dimension, and actually in terms of results. So clearly, output legitimacy, in a sense, that's one of the clues on trust performance. And I talk about it in the paper. I didn't talk about it in the spoken version of the paper, but in the written version of the paper, I do talk about it. And clearly, we have there are clearly different levels of performance, if you like, between the main countries in terms of their success. That's for sure. So in a sense, yes, I take that totally on board. On the scientists, again, I talk about that also in my paper, in the written version. But what's interesting about the scientists is that there's, and again, Dion can vouch to this because he's read the paper, but basically, what's interesting about the scientists is that there's clearly more transparency is needed for there to be a genuinely global epistemic community, medical epistemic community. And that really is, there've been difficulties in countries like France. So the Professor, how is it? The Marseille one.
You never tried the Marseille.
And the controversies around the science. Sorry, the controversies around the nature of scientific evidence. And I think I said in the written version of the paper is obviously, I mean, to some extent, what happens but France and UK is quite a good comparison because they're quite similar. I mean, in the UK you have SAGE, which is a scientific committee that justifies all decisions, but it is divided. In France, the Conseil scientifique is used in a slightly instrumental way to justify a series of decisions. Itself, it's divided. There's divisions on how do you put it, hydrocloxy, whatever it is, on the vaccine, on the drug, the strategy of lockdown. I mean, in a sense, these are all objects of division. And I do say that in the written version of the paper, I say actually, politicians and scientists have a bit of an objective interest because they're both, in a sense, their claim to embody trust has been contested. I'm not talking so much about health professionals, but certainly the medical scientists, there's a lot of controversy there, a lot of division, a lot of controversy. And there should be controversy in science, because science is all about controversy. And what I conclude in the written version of the paper is it's partly a temporalité thing, as the French would say, but it's clearly politics need immediate results. Get the vaccine, tell us the story, get the output. But of course, scientific debate's not all like that. Scientific debate, it's long, it's tedious, it involves experimentation, it involves failure. And so to some extent, it's almost built in that there's going to be a capability expectations gap between those two communities. I mean, I talk about it in the paper, but not in this version of the paper. I agree with everything else you said. Macron, I think, he's had a bit of a tough time, Macron. I think, he's not had a particularly good crisis, but in a sense, he's been, to my mind at least, and perhaps I've written a book on Macron, so I'm perhaps slightly have a sort of a priori that's quite favourable to him. And again, I think in a sense, Macron came in, his first year was quite extraordinary in a sense, by French terms at least. But then, he's had to face a series of increasingly insurmountable crises. And I suppose in a sense, that's what really defines political leadership. And I think in a sense, Macron has been found wanting somewhat, but then who would not be in the face of this crisis, to be honest? I think that all leaders, possibly with the exception of Merkel, have been found wanting. And Macron, no more than anybody else, certainly no more than Trump or Johnson or whatever.
We have a question.
Good.
Actually, it's not a real question, but just some like comments. But I think this is very inspiring because nowadays when we think about governance in the face of crisis all over the world, and actually this is not the first crisis, there are a lot of crises, and political scientists always try to find some framework to compare and to understand, how different countries are doing, in comparison with each other. But I think for the COVID-19, and now political scientists are still searching for such kind of framework in comparing and measuring the performance, because this is the first one which really, covers so many different countries and different types of regimes. And I do think this trust and the transparency combination can provide a very good comparative framework, which and as Professor Capstone just mentioned, they don't always go together, because normatively we think like trust and transparency, that's something we certainly want in crisis management at the same time. But I think we can use like a 2x2, these two dimensions to measure, the different combinations of trust and transparency, how they actually play out in the reality. And I can imagine that because different types of country or different types of political system, they have different combination of these, and that might be the way to think about how to explain, high trust, low transparency China, and how to explain this happened, and low transparency, high transparency but very low trust. This can also happen in democracy, and also the disaster is not something happen, once for all. That's just a snapshot of disaster. Disaster develops over time. So there are different stages of disaster. And for disaster management at the very beginning, immediately after the disaster occurs, you need to take quick action. And at that point of time, I think transparency might be difficult unless they already have a very good institutional foundation. But even for very healthy democracy, at a point of disaster happens, crisis take place, maybe you need to take some very quick action lacking transparency, but in this way still can win some trust. So maybe this kind of 2x2 table can also apply to not only different types of regime, but also different stages of development of the crisis. And then in this way, we can have a very good tool of comparing the governance, explaining the governance and also the governance outcome in different countries. So this might be, the paper might be trying to argue in a way that propose a framework in understanding comparative study. It's a new way of thinking about the 2x2 dimension to evaluate the governance of countries.
Thanks, Kenny. In fact, we have developed something called the Trust Transparency Matrix,
Yes.
which has that actually. High trust, low transparency,
And
low trust, low transparency, high. But that's a really useful set of comments. Yeah. And if I rewrite the paper, I'll let you have give me some critical feedback on it, because that would be very useful actually. A very nice set of comments. Thank you.
Yes, we have a question from Body here, Catherine Bola. Even though mixed messages are not good in pandemic, the medical scientists will come up with new results and solutions all the time. In Germany, there are people who read that as mixed message and are very dissatisfied. How can the politician avoid mixed messages and still be flexible and open to new insights of medical scientists?
I think that's an excellent question. It's a very, very difficult one to answer. I think it comes back in a sense to saying, well, we're analysing this a bit. We're cold when we're making this happen. You know, we're sort of we're trying to analyse this in a very cold way. We're removed. We're not actually at the heart of action. And clearly, if one's in the heart of political action, one has to respond to crisis. One has to accompany crisis with decisions. One is not an expert in medical science. This is the point that's come out very clearly, except perhaps Angela Merkel, but for various reasons for her own background. But I mean, most Macron, Johnson, these are not experts. So they have to demonstrate a degree of transparency by listening actually to the scientific advice. I mean, this is what should happen. And now clearly the scientific advice, this is where Professor Kevistan's point is an important one. The scientific device is divided. The scientific device is rarely, rarely conclusive. So it makes it extremely difficult for politicians. I think, however, and again, I think, once a line of, there's bound to be an initial period of floating. And then but once a broad line has been determined, once a broad decision has been taken, as far as possible, that decision should be legitimized, adhered to, or if it's wrong, there should be an admission, a sort of admission that it was wrong. For example, the case of masks. I mean, you guys know much more about that than I do, but clearly, if the feeling was that the mask originally, if the scientific advice was saying, well, masks are not actually that important, and then it transpires that masks are important, then I think acknowledging that, an acknowledgement of that, once and for all, is what's required. I don't think there's a real answer to that very good question. There's a set of observations. I'm not so sure there's a satisfactory answer. And this is one of the problems with this topic, because really, we have to feel a bit, towards the end of my paper, I was being a little bit normative, and I was doing it on purpose, actually. Not often like that, but I was doing it a bit on purpose. Because in a sense, if you're in a society that's full of contradictions, and you have to justify, and you have to change, and you have to sort of accompany that with argument and persuade, it's not easy, right? And so in a sense, I think that's why I was saying that it's perhaps, each system will react in different ways, and it's not a judgment on particular systems. But saying in those particular types of systems, it's much more difficult, actually, because you've got to find a way of actually accompanying the public.
Other questions?
I think Martin.
Oh, Martin?
Raise hand.
Yes. Okay, Martin wants to talk. How are you?
But we can't.
Can you speak?
The settings do not allow him to talk, so he has to type in his question.
Can you ask him this question?
Yeah, can you ask him to type in the question?
I should realize.
Sorry, but it was a mistake.
How can I turn on my mic? I can't answer that question.
So,
Just elaborate on what you said about the masks. You know, 2 months ago in France, people said to me, wearing a mask is not part of our culture. We'll never be used to it. You know, 2 months later, everybody wearing a mask in the underground. So, you know, there is a level of change and adaptability we shouldn't underestimate. And then it's a way of regaining trust because people change. So that you mentioned about temporality is very important.
Critical junctures.
Yeah.
There's a critical juncture in a crisis, and that can or punctuated equilibrium, whatever you want to talk about it, and that can fundamentally change behaviour. And you need a crisis actually to bring about that sort of change.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can, yes.
Oh, finally, thank you, thanks so much. Sorry, I can't make it like physically to the meeting, but I'm very interested in your talk, Alistair. Which brings me to mind. Sorry, I have to go beyond a bit of your, your frame of transparency and civil society, because it brings me to mind to a very, I think, very popular passage from the Analects, which is one of the Confucian classics. I'll just read it to you, a very short one, actually. So one of the students of the Master Confucius at Zigong asked about government. And the master said, well, the requisites of government are that there be a sufficiency of food, sufficiency of military equipment, and the trust of the people in their ruler. And then the student asked, well, what if we can't keep all three? Which one will you let go of, master? And the master said, well, get rid of the soldiers. And then the student said, well, what if the remaining two we also can't keep? We can only keep one. Which one should we let go of? And then the master said, part with the food, because from of old, death has been the lot of all men, but if the people have no faith in their ruler, there's no standing for the state. So this is the story, okay? And my question for you is this, Alistair. Do you think it is possible to, dispute this kind of Confucian hierarchy that the trust is more important than hard power? Trust is more important than economic power. Economic power is more important than military might. Can you dispute that, like, empirically with the cases that you see, or rather you see some kind of support for this kind of Confucian worldview, which I think, well, maybe looking at China now, you can argue that, well, this is exactly what is the case. Despite the military might of the PRC, despite the economic success, if you look at the percentage of people who are successful, who are rich, including in Hong Kong, who are either leaving or thinking of leaving, maybe there's something in it. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. That was a very interesting question. I learned a lot from your question. And I'll endeavour to answer it. But I, above all, learned a lot from the question. Let's put it that way. Now, I think in essentially, I think the emphasising the empirical bit is actually quite complicated. I think how you would actually operationalise that empirically would be, I think, extremely complicated. What one can say is, and if we just limit ourselves to, say, countries in Western Europe, which is the countries I know the best, you could say that there are vastly different levels of trust if we look at the surveys. Look at Eurobarometer or any of the big surveys. There's lots of them. European Social Values Survey, not all, but they all set out different sort of trust profiles, if you like, amongst the main countries. And take the French case, which is one I know extremely well. The French case has been a long tradition of mistrust of leaders in the French case. And yet there's also a political system that emphasizes very much the centrality of a leader, the French presidential system, actually. So it's a bit of a paradox in a sense. And if that political system starts to call into question the foundation of leadership, which is essentially based on a set of semi-presidential institutions, then in a sense it's as if the whole political system itself is being called into question, which is not actually what's taking place, because there's a fundamental degree, underlying degree, at least historically speaking, of support in the main political institutions. So that's a bit of a paradox. My answer is, I think in a sense, it's perfectly possible to have a governance without trust. And I'm not talking about the Chinese version of governance. Incidentally, I don't mention governance much these days. I have written 2 books with governance in the title. Not since 2008, but nonetheless. And I think in a sense there's a particular signification for governance that has to be understood in the sense of civil society, of public-private interactions, of democratic interchanges, and so on. But I'm not answering your question particularly about it, Martin, because it's a good question. I take it as an observation rather than a question. But I think it's possible, of course, even in democratic regimes, to have institutionalized forms of governing that don't actually rest on a particularly high level of trust, or where mistrust is allowed to express itself sporadically, but it doesn't get to a stage where it actually calls into question the functioning of the institutions, which is, I suppose, another way of answering Emily's question. So I think that, is trust the key variable? I think it's a bit difficult to admit that it is the key variable in governing. It's certainly an important variable. And I think there are alternatives to obviously there are alternatives to governing with trust. And, government can survive without trust. Governments survive without trust all over the world. Ian.
I have a question. Thank you very much for your presentation regarding trust and the quantification of trust. Most of you mentioned that in China, trust is a given, very high trust. But how can we make sure that the people answer honestly to the surveys, or that the information that we get from there is also honest? In a democracy, we can, of course, we have free access, and the people are not self-censored because they're not afraid that if they say they don't trust the government, something will happen to them. How can we make sure that the quantification of trust in illiberal democracies or in authoritarian regimes is trustable?
I think we can have, I won't answer the question about China, because I didn't actually talk about that measure in China, and there are people better qualified than me to answer that question. However, in more general democracies, if you like, or even things like world value surveys, there's a protocol. There's an agreed protocol about how do you answer the questions of trust. And I've looked at some of these very banal actually. Do you trust the army? Do you trust the police? Do you trust the media? Do you trust the politicians? No. Do you trust? And the answers are quite banal. But in a sense, at least there's a protocol, and the same questions are more or less asked everywhere. Whether those questions measure trust or not is of course another matter. You could argue they might measure one element of trust. They might measure that thin trust, which is critical trust. They don't necessarily measure the interpersonal trust, which would be much more difficult to measure. I suppose you could measure it in a certain version of rational choice if you're doing game theory analysis, in terms of the iterative nature of the games and the outcomes they get. In terms of intermediate trust, well, if you believe in social capital, if you take Putnam seriously, that's a form of territorial trust. It's very interesting, actually. Very, very criticised, all of that work, but it's nonetheless innovative. Can you actually measure trust territorially by comparing places? The article took me 5 years to write, that's just about to come out, is on territorial political capacity, how you actually measure, if you like. How do you measure regions comparatively in very different contexts? It's incredibly complex. But I basically argue that that argument can be for another day. But you can basically try and do it. So I think let's specify what we mean about measuring trust. If we say it's political trust, then let's take up the limitations of all these studies, including in Western liberal democracies, very limited studies. I'm not aware of the studies on China for the moment, but I know that there are studies on China, and I'll abstain from commenting on the validity of the answers to those, but I'll be guided by your question.
Yeah, just when you asked the question about trust, I was struck with a thought about, and I wonder if you have ever considered a relationship between trust and soft power. As we talk about, say, international system, obviously the way you use the notion of trust rather refers, the way I understand it, to domestic political systems or maybe regional systems, but in a global scale or in a context of the international system, I'm wondering whether there's any, according to you, correlation between trust and the so-called soft power. Obviously, the soft power. I mean, why I'm asking this question? A bit of background, but very, very briefly. I remember I was confronted many years ago at one of the conferences that actually we organized by a comment by one of our colleagues from another university that Soviet Union did not have any soft power, and that was one of the reasons why it imploded. And me being brought up in a communist country, I had to object. Soviet Union indeed did have a lot of soft power within the Eastern Bloc. It did. If depending on how you, of course, define soft power, but the most usual way is a certain attractiveness and a certain, there are reasons why this model is being emulated or why the culture is being attractive, and particularly social structures are being emulated and so forth. And I can tell you that the Soviet Union did have a soft power. The Russian, it comes as a surprise, but the way I was brought up in a communist country, absolutely, there's no question about it, right?
I remember the only time I went to the Soviet Union, because I did go to the Soviet Union, it was still the Soviet Union in 1991 it was. And I remember, because it was Yeltsin was in power. Yeah, but I was there. It was in February 1991. Yeltsin was in power. And I remember, I'm just giving you this anecdote while I think of an answer to your question. But I remember there were obviously thousands of people around. And all of a sudden there was a huge queue because they were selling beer. It was unbelievable. And we happened to be the fifth in the queue. We thought, what's happening here? We're just standing in the queue. And then there were about 3,000 people within about 5 minutes. They were selling this beer that wasn't actually very nice. But we bought some of this beer and drank it. And that's the anecdote for my answer. But it sort of got me to think, well, obviously, the way that system was operating at that time within Russia, within the Soviet Union at least, it was difficult to describe those phenomena in terms of trust, in a sense. I'm not in any sense disputing what you mean, more generally about soft power. I think soft power and trust, these are two elastic concepts. These are two ones that are very difficult to pin down. So if we're going to sort of correlate them, it would be extremely difficult. I suppose you could look in the, international relations literature, the idea of international regimes, for example, which is built on really a bit of trust. If you take the Franco-German relationship, you could say, well, actually, what's interesting about the Franco-German relationship? It's not just sort of hard interests they have in common. It's actually a much softer understanding of shared, softer sharing of understandings about what's necessary to do for Europe and what it goes a little bit beyond just the narrow calculation of, in a sense, their own hard power. And I suppose it's a bit, trust and soft power are a bit similar in the sense that you don't so much know the ingredients, but you know what happens when you've lost it. Okay. And I think it's clear with trust, but with soft power as well, it's clear. I mean, we just don't have to emphasize too much about the end of the American empire, really, under President Trump and perhaps predecessors as well. But clearly, one dimension of that is a loss of trust. And it's a loss of trust about a very interpersonal level and relationships of interactions between the US president and his main interlocutors. To the extent that the German Chancellor just basically says, well, I'm not going to come to your G7 meeting. And so Yeah, no, maybe that wasn't exactly how it happened, but clearly, there are clearly. So I think it's the question's easier to answer in the negative than in the positive. If I might leave it there.
I do think actually there are some maybe relationship between this, because I'm thinking about for quite a long time the world order is basically we think there are realistic picture, but at the same time different countries, they try very hard to build up all those connections and channels in order to sustain a more liberal idea of the world, and also a constructivist picture of the world. But after the COVID-19, I think this kind of order is going to change because of the growing distrust in certain countries, and the China maybe used to be quite attractive because of its promotion of Chinese culture and in a way to promote its soft power. But now, since the trust in this particular regime is declining, and the way it sells itself might be in a different way. And Taiwan is now having its soft power in a way because it did very well, manage the crisis very well, and it built a very good image. And so the trust, different countries, the people at least, they trust Taiwan and in a way of managing big issues. So the soft power might be on the rise. So I think that this also relates to the trust. You mentioned this international political trust, which I do think it will have some important implication of the changing of the world order. Yeah.
I mean, I think so as well. But the thing is, how do you, in a sense, it's almost how do you investigate this? I think Jean-Pierre and then Emily.
Yeah, I had a question about the UK, because you alluded to your country, but you didn't really discuss, for me, a situation which for me is a mystery, because as you know, Boris Johnson has sort of introduced various policies, kept changing its public policy regarding COVID-19, but the level of trust in the government in the UK is very high, as opposed to the level of trust in France. So how do you explain that?
On Boris Johnson, I think it's quite easy.
He got sick himself.
I think there is that personal dimension. He was very ill. That definitely had an impact. He did win a very convincing election victory in just only in December 2019. Whatever one thinks of the guy, he did win a convincing election victory. I think we had a sort of, he probably made the wrong decisions early on, but he did actually rectify himself. I mean, he could have. Okay, it was only the 23rd of March that they introduced the lockdown. It should have been earlier, but at least introduced it. So I think to some extent, he's born. Until the problem with Dominic Cumming, because that's the prince actually in the background, and in a sense, until then, Boris Johnson was was sort of winning the political argument. But subsequently, there's two main things. One is that particular sort of double language doesn't work. You don't have one treatment for your advisor and another treatment for everybody else. That is duplicitous. And if you look at the most recent surveys, the Conservatives have declined to just a 1-point lead over Labour now. There's a massive loss in support over the last 2 or 3 weeks, which is interesting. The second aspect, of course, is that we talk about the UK, but as everyone who heard Professor Scully's talk on Friday will know, there's the 4 different countries in the UK, particularly Wales, of course.
Nations.
Yeah, nations. But Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland have, because of devolution, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland have the power to determine their own arrangements in terms of coming out of lockdown. And Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland are not following England in terms of gradually easing the lockdown. So they are staying locked down for the moment, which will be catastrophic economically, but there you go, that's what's happening. And one of the paradoxes here is they're staying locked down, but the scheme, the so-called furlough scheme, which is basically the UK government paying the salaries of workers, including in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. That's very, very interesting, because it's basically the UK government that's paying the salaries of workers in the devolved nations, but the governments of the devolved nations are disagreeing with the central government. It's totally postmodern, whatever. And it's, but it's fascinating politically. I mean, I think there are issues of what I'll talk about when it's.
There are free riders.
Well, say that to Professor Scully, that'd be interesting. But there's clearly an element of free riding, absolutely.
Yes.
There is, you know, I mean, and but there's fascinating things going on in the UK. I mean, I think it's very sad actually because the death rate is very high, and hopefully, and the pubs are shut. And I can't go back because actually my father's quite ill, and I'd like to go back, but I can't do because there's no way you can get in at the moment. You know? So that's a bit of a pity. Anyway, so should we?
I just had a
Oh, sorry, you have
comment
another question.
for Connie. It just happened. I attended a webinar last night, and here we are into a comparative politics because you are mentioning that China's power is decreasing and Taiwan is rising, but in the Maghreb and Middle East region, it's very much a country. So China has been gaining a lot of soft power inside the crisis. So at the beginning, the Gulf countries sent back to China masks in December and January. And then after February, China sent back masks to those countries when they were hit. So China's soft power is increasing at a very rapid rate in this region of the world. So it depends. And in Europe, it's another story.
May I thank all of you out there on Zoom land, and my colleagues. Oh, sorry, there's many more chats. I think
no, they're from Martin, I think. Before.
Okay.
Another question?
No.
I think actually, as I'm timekeeper and presenter and head of department, I think that we have to probably say that this is the end of our session. But thanks to everybody for coming along, and thanks to me for giving the paper.
Very good.
Okay, so
Maybe you can leave.
I leave. Okay, bye bye.
And I've used because 3 of them, yes.
Okay.